Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you for joining us for the Naval War College Foundation's first Newport Lecture Series presentation of the 2021 to 2022 academic year, How the Afghanistan Tragedy Unfolded Over 20 Years. I am George Lang, CEO of the Naval War College Foundation, and it is truly my pleasure to welcome you this evening. I also want to thank Chairman Bilden, our esteemed Board of Trustees, members, friends, and benefactors, as well as my staff for their continued support and commitment for the rewarding missions of the U.S. Naval War College and Naval War College Foundation. Enabled by our generous foundation members, friends, and supporters for over 50 years, the college has continued its innovative, cutting-edge research, scholarship, and wargaming programs that have sustained it as America's premier institution and standard bearer for professional military education for our joint and combined force teams. The Naval War College Foundation is proud to support the U.S. Naval War College and its core values of military preparedness, leader development, and statesmanship, and remains committed to providing the critical resources needed to advance its priorities of research and scholarship, curriculum and instruction, endowments and endowed chairs, capital improvements, faculty and student academic achievement awards, conferences and symposia, and regional studies. Tonight's presentation is an example of the scholarly topics U.S. Naval War College students are immersed in and tackle during their 10-month rigorous academic program at the college, whose mission it is to educate and develop future leaders of our nation and the world. Before I continue, just a reminder that should a question come to you during the presentation, please submit it via the Q&A box, and I'll be happy to present it to our guest speaker during the Q&A session. There will be sufficient time for Q&A, and we will get through as many of your questions as possible in the time allotted. As I'd like to remind guests, these presentations are typically hosted monthly during the academic year at the Naval Station Newport Officers Club, usually preceded by a 30-minute reception where guests can mingle with Naval War College Foundation staff and friends, and typically the guest speaker of the evening. However, since COVID-19 took center stage almost 2 years ago now, we've been bringing Newport Lecture Series presentations and many others hosted by the Foundation to you virtually. A benefit of the virtual environment is the opportunity it offers to interact with and in some cases reconnect with many of our members and friends from across the nation and around the world while keeping everyone safe from COVID and the Delta variant strain. Now, to introduce and welcome your distinguished guest speaker for tonight's presentation. The Honorable F.J. Bing West is an American author, Marine combat veteran with 4 years in Vietnam as a Marine grunt, and many more years of experience in Iraq and Afghanistan wars. He's a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, as well as a former Dean of Research at the U.S. Naval War College. During his tenure as Assistant Secretary of Defense, he chaired the United States Security Commissions with El Salvador, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Pakistan, South Korea, and Japan. Mr. West has embedded across Afghanistan for a decade with more than 40 platoons and has written 4 bestsellers about the war in which he describes the fighting and the strategy. His most recent work is The Last Platoon, a novel of the Afghanistan War. Among other awards, Secretary West is the recipient of the Department of Defense Distinguished Public Service Medal, the Department of the Navy Distinguished Civilian Service Medal, and Tunisia's Médaille de la Liberté. A member of the Council on Foreign Relations in the Infantry Order of St. Crispin, he appears frequently on CBS and Fox News. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, please give a warm virtual welcome to the Honorable Bing West.
Thank you, George. Before I go any farther, I'd like to also express my thanks to Shannon and to Shwana for putting this together for me, and to you, George, as the director, and of course, to our extraordinary chairman, Philip Bilden. When I first began this series, George, can you see the slides that I'm showing now?
Not yet, Bing.
Then somebody has to take just a second to explain how I can get the slides to come up, because I'm showing a slide, but you're not seeing it.
Okay. Did you hit the shared screen at the top of the screen, Bing? Should be a button right at the top.
The button on the Zoom
Right, should be an icon right at the top.
Oh, got it. It's at the bottom.
Okay,
Okay, now I have it. Now you're seeing it?
you're cooking with gas.
Here we go. All right. So when we started, Philip Bilden said, Bing, I'd be delighted if you want to talk about your most recent book. And I had spent the last 2 years writing what I considered to be a metaphor for the 20 years of our war in Afghanistan. And the basic plot line was that the Taliban and a Marine platoon of 40 Marines were fighting to the death while Washington was trying to look for some way of getting out. And that proved to be a little bit too prophetic because here we are. And so Philip said, well, Bing, why don't you broaden it a little bit and talk about what you saw in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. And so when I look at Afghanistan, I really see it as a tragedy in 4 acts. The first, we had an opportunity to win. Then we shifted to nation building. Then we had a stalemate. And finally, we had a surrender. If you go to Act 1, in 2001, now consider this, 9/11, 3,000 civilians are killed in New York City. By December, within 4 months, we were moving against Al-Qaeda, and our goal was to destroy Al-Qaeda. That was why we were there. And we had Al-Qaeda trapped in a series of mountains called Tora Bora. We also had standing by 3,000 troops, Marines and the special forces from a dozen nations under General Jim Mattis, who was at that time a brigadier general. And their plan was to come in and surround Al-Qaeda in the mountains and finish them off. But instead, General Franks decided that he would use Afghan warlords rather than American soldiers. And the result was that Al-Qaeda escaped into Pakistan. So we had a chance to finish that war right at the start, but we didn't. And as a consequence, what happened was what I call Act 2. Beginning in 2002, and I believe he was driven by a very decent moral sense. President Bush said, we have to help the Afghan people, 30 million of them. And we have to begin nation building. But within a year, the president and his administration had focused on the Iraq war. So now they had 2 wars going on at the same time. And Afghanistan appeared to be a sideshow, except from 2004 on, the Taliban that had retreated with Al-Qaeda into Pakistan came back. I always considered Pakistan to be treacherous. They claimed to be our friends, but they weren't our friends. And they were giving the Taliban a 1,500-mile-long sanctuary for 20 years. You can't beat guerrillas if you give them a 1,500-mile-long sanctuary. So the decision was made, well, we will nation build to prevent the terrorists from using Afghanistan as a sanctuary. And the Army and the Marine Corps dramatically changed their doctrine, and I thought for the worse, to say that soldiers, American soldiers, are nation builders as well as warriors. Well, what did that mean? Well, as one general put it, this war in Afghanistan will be won not by destroying the enemy, but by persuading the population. Wow. I mean, stand back and think of that for a moment now. We're no longer sending warriors. We're sending people out there to, I don't know, have 5 cups of tea and win over the population. But how could our troops persuade 30 million tribesmen who were hurtling headlong into the 9th century? Well, the concept was called CounterInsurgency. And the idea was that American soldiers would clear the villages. Then the Afghan soldiers would come in and they'd hold the villages and they'd bring in material benefits like electricity and dams And then the tribesmen would support the government and turn against the Taliban. I thought from the start that that was mortally flawed as a concept. In my judgment, having fought for a long time in Vietnam and studied it up close, that the people were the prize. They weren't the means of winning. Riflemen do only one thing with a rifle, and that's not sip tea. But at the same time, President Karzai, the fellow we put in charge of Afghanistan, he was opposed to this strategy. And his government in Kabul were disconnected from the countryside. And when our soldiers got out into the countryside, they discovered that the Afghan soldiers had no intention of patrolling by themselves. They tag along with our American soldiers, but they wouldn't do it without us. So we ended up doing it for them. But we were fighting against the Taliban, who really reminded me of fighting the stories I read about fighting against the Apaches in the 1870s. Highly elusive, small bands, and they never stand to fight you if they think they're going to lose. And they can always run back to Pakistan, because Pakistan was only 60 miles away from where all the fighting was going on. And then there was one last thing. This whole issue of how many troops do you need to go out to the villages? We had on average 1 American or NATO platoon for every 10 villages, which means that you'd cycle through a village about once every 10 days. I had a combined action platoon in 1966 in Vietnam. My platoon was in one village with 5,000 Vietnamese for 1 year. One village, one platoon, 1 year. We were trying to do it on a shoestring, and we didn't have the forces to do it, even if everything else were true. But everything else wasn't true. And what I'd like to do is just spend a moment and show you what our troops were doing every day. This is typical combat. This is what we were doing every day.
This is what combat looks and sounds like when you're in the middle of it. You can hear the incoming. Right in front of us. We got one wall in front of us, and then an open field, and we're attacking in the northwest.
See, now they're trying to point out the Taliban that are in those buildings in the distance. You very rarely see them for more than a second or 2 seconds.
So we missed him. I mean, he was a nice shot for a minute.
Just cut round, we're going to cut round through there, through that entry and behind that mosque.
Are you wondering about the accents? Well, I was out with the British often and with the Afghans, as well as with the Marines and our soldiers.
Willie, you stay there.
Pretty good fight. An RPG incoming. Here comes another one. Oh, damn. Right over my head.
Getting so smart, boys.
We bound forward. They fall back.
Now, I took this movie in 2010. 2010, halfway through this. Look at that. Every day we were doing this. It was whack-a-mole that never ended. It flabbergasted me what we were doing and what we thought we were going to learn by doing this. And yet we persisted in this failure from 2002 to about 2013. And I've really asked myself many times, why? Look, this book, The Wrong War. I wrote this book in 2010 after I had been over there with our troops time and time again. I said, this isn't working. Made no difference. We just continued year after year. And I think that the reasons are as follows. First, there was no penalty for anyone at the top, a colonel or a general, for failing because it was impossible to lose a battle. I mean, we had overwhelming firepower, so you could never lose. It's just that you weren't winning. But we didn't have any honest measurement system or bottom line. Look at this quote by Secretary of Defense Gates in 2011. We've thrown the Taliban out of their home turf. I thought, where is he? He's not over here because they're right here. They haven't gone anywhere. But somehow the generals had persuaded the Secretary of Defense that it was different than it was. And what I think happened is that we had a decade of whack-a-mole, say from 2002 to 2013. And I think that exhausted much of the goodwill at home, because after a while, the people were saying, we're spending all this money, we're trying to do all this, and we're getting, our troops are getting killed, and what's happening? And then you'd say, well, what about in the military or the Pentagon? Why didn't they know this? I believe it's because there is in the Pentagon no chief risk officer. And by that, I mean, if you're in a major corporation and the CEO is thinking of a radical plan, he wants to do something really different. He has within his executive committee somebody who's called the chief risk officer. And that person's job is to be looking at what the executive officer, the CEO, wants to do and saying, does he really get an idea of all the risks? And I found it amazing reading the newspaper the other day to see that one of these generals, General McChrystal, he was asked about Afghanistan in retrospect. He lectures a lot now. And he said, I don't think we ever talked about where this is going to be in 20 years. Whoa, you get into a war and you don't ask the basic question, how does it end? And where are you going to be in 20 years? And so by about 2014, we stopped with this counterinsurgency nation building, just called a halt to it. And I think President Obama deserves some of the credit for this, because President Obama said, I'm not going to continue just to do this. And he cut back on the troops. So our military changed what it was doing. It stopped the nation building. And instead it said, we're going to pivot just to training the Afghan army and bombing the living bejesus out of the Taliban. The cost plummeted. The cost of us for the last several years in Afghanistan has been 2% of the defense budget, and we've lost very, very few people, except unfortunately in the evacuation. As a result, I think by 2020, the Congress and the public, they were, I would say, almost indifferent. I've looked at a lot of surveys, and when you're asked, do you want to stay in Afghanistan or do you want to leave? You ended up with a 50-50. I don't really know about this, because on the one hand, I think the public had become disaffected after a decade of casualties trying this nation building and spending over $1 trillion. But on the other hand, for the last several years, we haven't heard anything about Afghanistan. And when we entered 2021, we had a situation where the Taliban controlled the countryside. They were out in all those farms everywhere, but they couldn't mass. They couldn't bring their forces together in vehicles and move against the cities because we were going to bomb them every time. In all due respect, President Biden has asked, what was in our national interest to stay in Afghanistan? In my judgment, we had a national interest to stay. And I'd like to show it just on these two slides. Here's the first one. And here's the geopolitical, we stay because it's in our geopolitical interest. Look at where we were in Afghanistan with this fantastic base called Bagram Air Base, which is bigger than any airport in the United States, huge. And we had bombers there whenever we wanted. We had Predator drones there. We had fantastic intelligence. And we had a network the CIA had built up throughout the entire Central Asian region over the last 20 years. CIA did a pretty darn good job. So can imagine if you're Iran and you're looking at this and you're saying, here I am, and here's those damned Americans right next door with all the power if anything happens. And imagine if you're China and you're thinking, well, I want to do this, that, or the other thing. And then somebody says, oh, by the way, sir, we have to be careful of our western flank because look where the Americans are. And if you're the Russians, they look down, they say, my God, they're looking right up at us. So I would argue that it was in our own strategic national interest to stay at the tiny level we were there with 3,000 troops. And there was a second reason. I indicated, yes, I was opposed to nation building. But once you start down that road and you offer to all the children and all the girls and all the women of Afghanistan a new life, I think you have a moral obligation. You don't just walk away from it, but we did. So I would argue for our own national interests and because of our moral obligation, we should have stayed. But instead, we chose self-defeat. The military believed that this stalemate they had would hold indefinitely. The intelligence community warned the president that the country would fall unless we kept a few Americans there. But President Biden ignored both the military and the intelligence, and he ordered the pullout. And as a consequence, Afghanistan has once again become a terrorist sanctuary. I'll just be blunt about it. I think there was dereliction of duty. And I think many people at the top in the State Department, the Pentagon, and the White House knew that Americans would be left behind. It wasn't they were all surprised in August. Nothing had been done about getting out those 40,000 American citizens and those who had the visas. Nothing had been done for several months. And then we're going to pull out all our troops in August and think that they were going to come out later? No, I don't buy that for a moment. So I think that there really was dereliction of duty. My argument is that losing was not inevitable, but we have an elected commander-in-chief. We elected him, and therefore he chose to quit. I think it's the most shameful bug out in decades. And we all have to be asking one question: who will fight for us the next time? So when I look at this, the consequences of this surrender, I see the following. The FBI and the CIA have both said that terrorists now pose a greater danger. And we left behind billions of dollars in arms as well. Let's face it, Allied trust in us has plummeted. Military recruiting is going to become harder. I mean, what do you say to a person after you lose a war? And Iraq wasn't any great shakes either. There's definitely been a loss of confidence in our generals. There has to be sooner or later a reckoning about how we had all these generals who went. We must have had over 60 generals in Afghanistan, and they had 20 years. And finally, those Americans we've left behind, the Wall Street Journal this morning calculated one figure of 8,000. Well, that's a festering hostage crisis that's going to be there for quite some time. So that's my overview. I wish I could be more optimistic about it, but that's what I saw, George. And I'm sorry that it ended this way, because I don't believe it had to end this way.
Yeah, well, thank you, Secretary West, for your thoughtful remarks and commentary. It's obviously a current event, and it's I think a lot of America is still a little bit in shock in what occurred and over such a lengthy period of time. But with that said, so, ladies and gentlemen, I'd now like to open up the floor for questions. As I mentioned previously, please submit them via the Q&A box, and I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Secretary West is also very comfortable operating in this virtual space, so he may even answer a question or two directly. Secretary West, as I see, maybe you're looking at the first question now. There's several now in the queue, but the first question from John Hooper: is there an application here of General Douglas MacArthur's assertion that the purpose of war is victory, not prolonged indecision? This was a speech, I guess, before the joint session of Congress in 1951. I believe, Mr. Johnson, I believe his words were prophetic, re the Vietnam and Afghanistan. Thank God for your candid analysis and your thoughts, sir.
That's what I thought we had a military for. I was that our military went in and said, we're not there as warriors, we're there as nation builders, I thought was nuts. But at the same time, I have to say that as long as the Taliban had a sanctuary in Pakistan, we couldn't finish them off. So I believe he's one of my heroes, I'll just say, General Dunford. When General Dunford took over there in 2014, he changed the strategy and he made it training the Afghan soldiers. That isn't victory. That's fighting for a stalemate. But sometimes that's about as well as you can do it. So I agree with what Mr. Hooper is saying. We got ourselves into such a mess that I couldn't see how we could get out of it that way. But I do have grave reservations. I might as well just put it right out there. I do have grave reservations about what our military has learned and where they see themselves going. Let me just pop back here for a minute and show you what I'm really concerned about with the military. Look, what's the focus of our military today? Is it diversity or is it lethality? And the last two secretaries of defense have defined it exactly opposite to each other. Look at what this first quote is from Secretary of Defense General Mattis. We have no God-given right to victory. Our leaders must make our force more lethal. Then look at what the current Secretary of Defense says. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is important. We're going to make our military look more like America. Well, which is it? Are we going to make our military more lethal or more like America? Because 75% of America cannot qualify for the military. And the military isn't more like America. The military is comprised of warriors who generally come from the middle class, who ironically more come from Republican states than Democratic states, who happen to be predominantly male, who happen to be predominantly white, who happen to have come from families that are predominantly stable. None of that defines making the military look more like America. And, you know, what is the focus that we're taking away after Afghanistan? And you all love the Navy. You're here because you love the Navy. So let me just put this one up too. Where is the Navy's focus? Look at this statement. It is a meritocracy, our Navy, Vice Admiral John Newell, Chief of Naval Personnel, said, but we want diversity. Try to figure that one out. Is it meritocracy or diversity? And then the Chief of Naval Operations, whom I understand is really a very, very nice guy. He said, Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Gilday, said, based on talking to the sailors, there's racism in the Navy. Well, a four-star now, the sailors confess to the four-star that they're racist, but what was the four-star doing when he was a captain or when he was a lieutenant commander? How did he suddenly just know this? And look at this other one. I urge all of you that are interested in the Navy to look at this. It's called the Report on the Fighting Culture of the Surface Fleet. You can get it on Google in a second. And this was done by a retired Rear Admiral and a retired Major General in the Marines, whom everyone respects, the two of them. They went out and interviewed 400 sailors and officers in the surface fleet. And what a devastating report. But this is how they summed it up. They said, there is insufficient focus on warfighting in the surface fleet of the United States Navy. And I'm reminded of John Paul Jones, of course, the father of the US Navy, saying, I have not yet begun to fight. So I guess my question for the Pentagon, the question for the Navy is, when are you going to begin to fight? I mean, you asked me a question, you want to get an answer.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. From Cornelia Weiss, why, and I recognize some of these questions, of course, we're all scratching our head, and you may or may not be able to answer, but from Cornelia Weiss, why did the US military never create a plan to fulfill the promise that the US would not abandon the women of Afghanistan?
Thank you very much, Cornelia Weiss, but it wasn't the military's, yeah, this is the dilemma. The military does some planning, but the State Department is supposed to be an overall charge, but the president is in charge of that. And it is manifestly clear to me that the president had made up his mind a long time ago. And no matter what anyone said to him, he wasn't changing his mind. I just saw him before the United Nations. I was flabbergasted. He said, we have to do more for the people of, for the women of Afghanistan. Therefore, I have 100 countries that agree with me that the Taliban have to treat them better than they've treated them in the past. Whoopee. I mean, the military couldn't do it. The military said, Mr. President, please, sir, we want to stay. And the president said, no, you're coming out.
Yeah. So again, it's the foundation. Of course, we do not take political sides, of course. So Bailey, I'm sorry, Bailey Selechnik. His question is, why haven't you mentioned the deal President Trump made with the Taliban?
Yeah, good. Very good point. Very good point. And I absolutely should have. So thank you very much. The answer is, I thought President Trump was equally disgraceful in what he did in terms of cutting a deal with the Taliban and releasing 5,000 prisoners. He really twisted the arm of the Afghans to let them go in exchange for 1,000 prisoners who were the Afghan soldiers. But the one thing I have to say about President Trump, and I thought that was absolutely wrong. The one thing no one has ever accused President Trump of is not changing his mind. So he wasn't president. President Biden was president. And none of us will know whether President Trump really would have pulled the plug or not. And I'll give you the example. Secretary Mattis, General Mattis, okay, when he was Secretary of Defense, we had at that time some special forces in Syria with some of the Kurd forces that have been fighting with us against ISIS on that front. And President Trump said, no, I'm pulling them out. And Secretary Mattis went over and met with him and said, sir, if you do that, I have to resign because I gave my word. Well, President Trump said, well, so Secretary Mattis resigned. In this case, nobody resigned. The interesting thing of what did President Trump do after the resignation? He recognized that he was stuck, so he never pulled out those troops. And so I think we'll never know, but if one of the senior people, the Secretary of Defense or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, had gone to President Biden and say, sir, if you're getting out and leaving those civilians behind, I have to resign. It may have come out differently, but I don't know. But I do agree that President Trump deserves definite criticism for what he did.
Oh, thank you. The next question is from Fred Colbrook. Some feel we won the war by 2002 and should have left then. Is there any merit?
Yeah, yes. But I would have preferred if we had knocked off Al-Qaeda, and we could have. If you go back to what I said, we had them trapped. We could have finished them off. Then we would have left a mess behind. All right, leave a mess behind. We didn't have to do everything we did in Afghanistan. We did it, I think, because we were so rich and because we're so decent. I mean, that's part of it too, that we felt we could do something. And then we got into the quicksand. And then as several have asked, well, why didn't the military recognize it was in for 20 years or more? I can't answer that question.
Yeah, I don't understand. From my trustee emerita, Diane Disney, she actually asked, I think, a similar question as the last one. She said, why did you attach no blame to ex-President Trump's agreement to withdraw by now?
Yeah, but I didn't. That was a good catch on the part of, that was a good catch, and it was a legitimate catch. The only thing I'm saying is, I'm not defending President Trump. The only thing I'm saying is he wasn't president. So we don't know what he would have done. And we have the example of where he changed his mind when he was confronted. And we don't know if somebody had confronted President Biden and said, sir, if you're leaving those American citizens behind, that is against my duty, and I'm afraid I have to resign. He may have, he would have been, President Biden would have been put in a hard spot if somebody had said that to him.
Yeah, thank you. From Chuck Turbach, in Vietnam, the ROE allowed us to reconnaissance by fire. In Afghanistan, the ROE seemed to hamper our ability to really engage the enemy. Your thoughts?
This is a tough one. I felt at certain points, well, up along the DMZ when I was there in 66 and 67 in Vietnam, it was a absolute, as Chuck Turbach indicated, a slugfest. I mean, you were getting hammered and you were hammering. In Afghanistan, you didn't have the same intensity, but on the other hand, some of the generals went entirely too far in hamstringing us in ways that they never should have. My rule of thumb is leave it to the commander on the ground, because if he is a decent and honorable person, and he is, if he's going to be an officer or a sergeant in our forces, he is the one responsible at the point. Don't try to have somebody way back making those kinds of decisions.
Yeah, great, thank you. John Parkhurst, again, a kind of a similar question as before, but we'll move to Roger Servicen. How do you think it would have ended, and when do you think this would have happened if we had stayed?
Oh, well, if we had stayed, we hadn't lost a single soldier in 18 months. Our CIA had so penetrated those terrorist networks. If you had allowed the commanders to continue to strike the way General Scotty Miller, who was in charge, the way he was striking, I think that this stalemate, as I indicated, would have been indefinite. And the only way it would have broken is because of Pakistan. And I don't know how that would have worked out. Pakistan was treacherous, is treacherous, and has 60 nuclear weapons. So as long as they gave a sanctuary to the Taliban, and I hate to just cop out, but I don't know how it would have ended one way or the other, but I do know we would have put more and more pressure on Pakistan, and Pakistan is an economic basket case. If they don't get aid from the international financial systems, they cannot exist. So we had leverage that I think we would have gradually begun to really use to tell Pakistan to knock it off.
Thank you, sir. From Stephen Alexander, do you foresee we will have to go back and fight there? And if so, how would you execute a return strategy and tactics?
Look, I can't foresee the future. We all know if we have one strike in the United States with substantial casualties, some Americans are going to go back to where that strike came from. And I think in that case, you're going to see no nation building on the part of our military. I think you're going to see one very tough force go in with a very deliberate plan of isolating whatever group we think that is and annihilating them.
Yeah. The a thoughtful question here from Ann Bodine. I agree with much of your analysis and thank you for your perspectives. I don't see the reckoning for the generals. In fact, the Washington Post just had an article about lucrative post-retirement jobs for many of these people, and the defense budget shows that the military remains the tool of choice for statecraft despite huge losses in Afghanistan and Iraq. How do we prompt this reckoning, do you think?
I anticipated I might get a question of that sort. And I'm trying to remember, George, where I go to show a slide that I think really should be seen. How do I do that again?
So you want to share your screen?
I want to go back to my sharing the screen.
Right, it might be at the bottom. There you go.
I got it at the bottom. Okay. That's a very good question. And the generals, they all sit on, I mean, they all become the top generals all become very wealthy. They're very respected in corporations. They sit on the boards, et cetera. They give lectures. Wow, and they lost the war. So I've thought a lot about this, but I'm not as good as two others. And therefore, I hope some of you are, when you're at home, I hope you're, having a beer or wine and, maybe some hors d'oeuvres, and you might have a piece of paper around. If you do, I strongly recommend you write these two down. One is the RAND Corporation, just RAND Corporation. It's called Raising the Flag. It's fascinating. It explains how you make general or admiral. And you don't have to read the whole report. There's a slide at the beginning that I would have done here if I had the competence to do it, that indicates the variables that cause you to become a general or an admiral. Hint, hint. Your little network that you work with as you rise is critical, especially in the Navy. And you stay inside that group. You don't do anything that is too radical to get that group opposed to you, because they're the ones you're going to rise with to the top. Then there's another report. This one is just called Losing Small Wars: Why U.S. Military Culture Leads to Defeat, by Andy Milburn. Now, Andy and I have been on battlefields together for 20 years. He's really a smart colonel, special operations, Marine, et cetera. And he spent a couple of years of his life working on this. It's fascinating. But his thrust is that generals become risk averse to taking major risk, because when they're coming up through the ranks, they can only advance at a certain speed, because the military is a guild. You start at the bottom, you go to the top, and nobody's allowed in from the outside. And after a while, you learn the rules of the road. And one of the rules of the road, and obviously you had counterinsurgency for 10 years when it was nuts, that one of the rules of the road is that you don't rock the boat too much. And during World War II, the number of changes that we made in our generals and our admirals and our submariners, et cetera, was extraordinary once we were really at war. So I don't have the answer to the question, but I do know the question is now being raised. And I think it starts with the chairman. I mean, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I think he's a nice guy, but he's gotten so far out there now on so many different things that the reverberations are such that it would be better if he didn't stay as a general, I think. But the generals have gotten themselves into a position where it's going to take them a while to sit down and ask, and others should ask, how do we unscramble this? And I keep coming back to, you need a risk manager when you go to war, but it can't be among the generals, because that's not how that system works. It has to be somebody in the Pentagon doing it. But no Secretary of Defense has such a person right now.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you for that response. From trustee Doug Newhouse, Bing, why did General Franks decide to use the Afghans and not the US forces when he had Al-Qaeda surrounded?
You'd have to ask General Franks that. Don't ask certain other people. Don't ask General Mattis, because boy, oh boy, you get an answer. And don't ask Vice Admiral Harwood, who was in charge of our special operations forces, because the two of them were poised and ready to go, and they were pulled back. It had, I think, something to do with let the Afghans do it kind of thing, but it was just a bad mistake, a bad mistake.
Thank you. From Paula Scanlon, kind of broad, what should this outcome teach future presidents and chiefs of staff?
I missed that one. Could you say that again a little bit slower?
Sure. So it's actually from Mike and Paula Scanlon. What should this outcome teach future presidents and, I guess, their respective chiefs of staff?
I wonder if they mean the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the chief of staff to the White House. But my view of presidents, and I've known 5 presidents, and my superstar was President Reagan. I thought he was the greatest when I would go in to brief him. But overall, I have this view, that the Congress has been derelict in their duty for one reason. They become so divisive that they cannot agree as a Congress to stand up for themselves. So gradually, beginning with Vietnam, they conceded all the power to the president, beginning with President Johnson. And the way President Johnson treated the Joint Chiefs of Staff, it was, I mean, the actual stories about him swearing at them and cursing them, amazing. But I think what's happened is that the president has gained so much power, he's like a king. And when you go into the Oval Office, when you go into the White House and you walk down the thickly carpeted corridors and the Secret Service men are around and everyone speaks in whispers, and you have the beautiful artwork of Ansel Adams, et cetera, on the walls, then you enter that Oval Office. I don't care who you are. You understand you are dealing with the most powerful person in the world, and you become very measured in ways you wouldn't think you would until you're there. And the president tends to surround himself with people, let's face it, who kisses Fanny to a certain extent. So they begin to live in their own world, honest to goodness. They live, and I've been there, you know, when I was an assistant secretary and a couple of other times when I was with Jim Schlesinger, et cetera. And it's hard to penetrate to that internal circle. So I could say what a president could do, but who am I to tell a president? The only thing I can say overall is our presidents have gradually become like kings. And that's exactly what the founding fathers and James Madison were most concerned about. We don't have a division of responsibility and authority. The Congress is the only one that has the authority to declare war, but they haven't done so in, golly, what, 50 years? So they let the president gather all this into himself. Then if he decides to pull a bonehead stunt, like just pull out because he feels like pulling out, which is what President Biden did, there's nobody to stop him. The Congress hasn't stood up for itself, and it hasn't stood up for itself because it's so divided. And that really worries me for the future of America. It really does.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. We have about 7 minutes left. From Martin Kaminsky, can you explain how after Vietnam, our government enmeshed itself in another war thousands of miles away from home in a forbidding terrain, a weak overall government, and a little hope of winning the hearts of the people?
No, I cannot, because I, after being over there, wrote the book and said, this is the wrong war. And I wrote a book called The Village about my experiences when I was in Vietnam and how hard it is and how long you have to work. Again, you don't become a general unless you're very articulate. And and you're a very shrewd bureaucratic player, because every general has had 2 fitness reports a year for 25 years before he becomes a general. Now, what kind of person has 50 perfect fitness reports? A very shrewd bureaucratic player who knows when to pick his shots and knows how to talk and knows how to write. And I read this doctrine that the Marines and the Army came out that all the generals were raving about, where it said we had to be nation builders as well as warriors. And I said, this thing is nuts. But they had all bought in on it. And they continued for 10 years, 10 years. So I get back to, wow, why I can't answer the question. But I do know part of it was that each chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff became a cheerleader instead of a risk manager, looking at this and not getting so close to all the other 4-stars that he got sucked into just going along. I had one very senior officer say to me when I said, this is nuts. And he said, Bing, my job is to support Dave Petraeus. And I realized he was higher up on the chain of command, but the way he saw his duty was always to the one chief executive officer under fire. But that leads to the question, well, who's apart from this, who knows what's going on? And I think that's the great defect. We don't have a chief risk manager.
Consistent message. So thank you. About 5 minutes. So Colin Osborne said, once the decision was made to get out, should it have been done later in the year during the winter season?
Okay. Boy, oh boy. I'm so peeved about this that I'm looking over here at the one slide I have about this. And now, again, I'm going to come to, I'm kind of a very slow learner. You got to tell me again how I do that, George.
So at the bottom, share screen.
All right, got it. Yeah, just keep doing that I'm a Marine, just a grunt, Okay. All right, here I go again. I share it, and I have the wrong one, but I'll get it. Here we are. All right, the question is very, very simple and very profound. Why did we leave so many American citizens behind? I mean, we have an entire southern border that's wide open, and millions of people can just walk in. Why did we leave behind American citizens in Afghanistan? This is how I see it. In April, President Biden said, I want you out by 9/11, a singularly terrible day, but he thought he was going to have a triumph. And then somebody said, hey, sir, you better not make it 9/11. So he said, okay, 31 August. All right. On that date in April, there were approximately 40,000 American citizens and visa holders in the country of Afghanistan. Now, President Biden says, I want all the troops out by August. However, the intelligence community said, and this gets to the question, they believe that Kabul probably would not fall until December. But consider that. They knew Kabul was going to fall. It was just a question of when. But they thought they'd have a few more months, which is, could we have stayed until the fighting season was over? Well, the president said, no, those troops are coming out in August, period. And in August, are you ready for this? In August, the State Department that is in charge of getting our American citizens out of the country says there are still 40,000 American civilians in Afghanistan. The State Department had done nothing. April, May, June, July, and August, they hadn't done anything. So what you end up with is their plan was that if they had a plan, I doubt if they had a plan, but if they had a plan, it was that they were going to get the American civilians out months after our troops had left. I mean, that is purely nuts. So when people say, well, you know, we didn't expect Kabul to fall that quickly, that is plain disingenuous. And could we have stayed longer? Well, I heard, and they bottled this up, but I heard that General Miller, who was in charge over there, and he's a super commander, I heard he said, sir, I have to stay. And he was overruled. But the idea that it was because they thought there was more time is preposterous. Can you imagine, as the city fell, trying to get all those people out when we hadn't done anything, when we had the time to do it? So I think it's a disgrace.
Thank you, sir, for handling that volley of questions. I think that was probably the most that I have ever seen in one of our presentations. So well done to you. Thank you again. It was truly an honor and a privilege to host you this evening and to speak about such an interesting and relevant topic. And we appreciate you taking time out of your very busy schedule to spend it with us this evening.
Well, you're quite welcome, George. But now that I know how to do this thing, let me do one thing, because Philip Bilden was kind enough to offer for me to do it so that I have a chance to talk about my book. So I have an hour's lecture on my book. So if you all will get a second beer or a second wine, we'll start in on my book. But it's a terrific book. I had to get a plug into myself, but you know, that's neither here nor there. The real truth is that I'm sorry for what happened in Afghanistan and for how it ended. And I thank you, George, and I thank Philip Bilden for allowing me to just say what was on my mind.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I know we had originally had it set up as a presentation by you. It was kind of an extended Newport Lecture Series that we had planned in person, but again, with the Delta variant, we decided it was probably more prudent to do this. And you had offered to sign some of your books there that evening. So
that's
that opportunity.
But listen, and thanks a lot for, you know, teaching me how to use Zoom and, you know, PowerPoint. You know, hey, I've learned a lot tonight. Thank you.
You are quite welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes tonight's presentation. Our next lecture will be on Wednesday, October 20th by Dr. Nicholas Bostev, who will present remarks regarding U.S. and Russia relations. I suspect this presentation will also be virtual, but should we shift to in-person at the Naval Station Officers Club, we will update you via email and post the latest status on our webpage at nwcfoundation.org. Thank you for tuning in tonight, and thank you all of you, for your wonderful support for the missions of the U.S. Naval War College and the Naval War College Foundation. The end of our fiscal year is rapidly approaching, and we still have a lot of work to do to generate the resources required by the college to educate and inform today's decision makers and tomorrow's leaders to anticipate and prepare strategically for the future, strengthen the foundations of peace, and create a decisive warfighting advantage, much of which Secretary West had mentioned here this evening. Your support is an investment in their learning in our national security, so thank you. The Naval War College Foundation Board of Trustees and staff are working hard to expand our membership and raise awareness of our great institution, of our great organization, of course, and a great institution, which is the Naval War College. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you're already a Naval War College Foundation member, please consider a gift of membership to your friends and neighbors who may also be interested or concerned as you are in issues affecting our national security. Details are available on our website under membership. Thank you again for your continued support and advocacy, and have a great rest of your evening and stay well.